The hawk she raised from a chick was killed for sport. A Lakota chief set a new one on her wrist. The hawk's blood was still on the post when I rode in. Not a lot of it, just a dark smear on the top rail of her fence and a scatter of feathers, red-tailed, the long primaries gone stiff in the morning cold. Somebody had wrung the bird's neck or come close to it, and then left it in the dirt by the gate like a thing discarded, like refuse. I pulled up my horse and looked at it a long time before I dismounted. I had come to trade, dried venison, 2 dressed pelts for flour and salt. That was all I wanted from this woman's place. She had a small farm at the edge of what the whites called the Dunmore Valley, a low square house and a barn that leaned east from the prevailing wind, and a reputation in the territory for fairness. I had traded here before, never trouble. But that hawk, I knew that bird, not by name. She had named it that I didn't know, but I had seen it on her wrist twice before. A red-tailed hawk with one white secondary that caught the light wrong made it look silver. She had carried it like it was nothing unusual, like a woman carrying a hawk to the field was an ordinary thing, and maybe out here it was. She was not an ordinary woman. I crouched and picked up one of the long primaries, still supple. This was done this morning. I heard the door. She came out onto the porch with a rifle, and her face was something I will not easily forget. Not crying. Past that. Her eyes had gone somewhere behind her eyes, and the rifle was held in both hands at her side, and she was looking not at me but at the post, at the smear. I set the feather down. She said without looking at me, "You see who did it." It wasn't a question. I had come from the North Trail. Anyone who came from the North Trail would have passed the Gantry brothers' camp, a quarter-mile up the creek. I had passed it. I had seen their fire, their horses. I had not thought much of it at the time, a young red-tail hawk tied by the leg to a wagon spoke, flopping on a short line while 2 men laughed. I said, "The Gantry men." She breathed once through her nose, set the rifle against the post, looked down at the dead bird and then looked away, and I saw her jaw tighten, hold. I said, "How long did you have it?" She said, 4 years, pulled it from a nest when it was 4 days old. Crow had knocked the nest, I climbed up for it. She paused, named it Cora. 4 years. A red tail can live 20. I thought about that, 4 years of building something, feeding it strips of mouse and rabbit from your hand, carrying it through wind, teaching it the air. 4 years of something wild and good that chose to come back to you. And then 2 men, bored and careless, decide to kill it for the sound it makes. I stood up. I had not decided anything yet, but something in me had settled, the way a stone settles to the bottom of a current. I said, "I will go to them." She looked at me then. Her name was Delia Marsh. I had heard her called other things, Widow Marsh, the Marsh woman, that woman who lives alone on the lower creek, but I knew her as Delia because that is what she had told me her name was the first time we traded. She had shaken my hand. Most white people in the territory did not shake my hand. She had, and she had looked me in the eye when she did it, and I had not forgotten. She said, "You don't have to do that, Lakota." I said, "I know I don't." I got back on my horse. The Gantry brothers, there were 3 of them, though the third was barely a man, 16 or 17, all chin and boots, had a fire going and coffee on, and they were not expecting company. They had not heard me come. I ride quiet by habit, by something that was trained into me before I had words for what training was. My father's doing, and his father's before him. I stopped at the edge of their fire's light. The oldest one, Dale Gantry, saw me first. He was a big man, thick across the chest, with a beard he didn't quite have the face for. He set down his coffee and stood up in that careful way men stand up when they don't want to look like they're standing up to anything. He said, "Chief." I hate that word from men like him. It is not a greeting. It is a category. It is a way of putting a man in a box so you don't have to see him. I said, "The hawk." The middle one, Burl, I had heard him called, looked at his boots. The youngest one looked at Dale. Dale said, "What hawk?" I looked at him for a moment. I have learned over many years that silence is a more useful tool than most men understand. Dale Gantry was not comfortable with silence. He shifted his weight. He said, "That thing was half dead already, just a bird." I said it was not half dead, and it was not just a bird. He said, "Now look here." I said it belonged to Delia Marsh. She raised it from 4 days old. I let that sit. You killed it for sport. He said, "We found it." I said, "You found it on her property, tied to her fence post, where it slept every night for 4 years. You untied it and you killed it." Burl was still looking at his boots. I said, "I want the youngest one to ride to the nearest town and come back with a red-tailed hawk, dressed and healthy, from whatever source he can find. I want it here by sundown tomorrow. And I want you," I looked at Dale, "to ride to Delia Marsh's property today and tell her plainly what you did and why it was wrong. Not to me, to her." Dale's face did something complicated. He said, "I'm not going to." I said, "You will." I said it the same way I say everything. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach for anything at my side. There was no point to threats with a man like Dale Gantry. He didn't respond to threats. Threats made him dig in. What he responded to, what most men of his type responded to, was a certain quality of stillness. The kind of stillness that says, "I am not afraid of you, and I am also not going anywhere, and I have decided." He looked at me for a long time. He said, "That woman's nothing to you." I said, "She trades fair. She treated me with respect when most in this valley did not. That is enough." He looked at the fire. He looked at Burl. Burl gave him nothing, kept his eyes down. I said, "Sundown tomorrow." I turned my horse and rode back south. I traded my venison and my pelts, and I stayed that day. I didn't decide to stay, exactly. It was more that I unsaddled my horse and put him in her paddock, and she didn't say anything about it. And I split wood for her until my arms were tired, and we ate together at her small table. She had made some kind of stew, nothing fancy, beans and salt pork, and a piece of cornbread so dry it needed the broth to go down, and we didn't talk much, and that was fine. She asked me about my family. I had 3 daughters and a son. She said she'd had a son once, died in his 3rd winter of a fever. I said I was sorry. She said it was a long time ago. But the way she said it told me it was not really, not in the way that matters. I asked about her husband. She said he had come out here to homestead, had worked himself down to nothing in 3 years, and gone one morning to get the horses and not come back. She didn't know if he was dead or gone by choice. She had decided eventually it didn't much matter. I said, "You stayed." She said, "This is my land." She said it simply, like a fact about the weather. "I'm not leaving it." I thought about that for a long time after. The kind of woman who will say, "This is my land, I'm not leaving it." Alone on a creek bottom, a rifle by the door, trading with whoever comes. A hawk named Cora on her wrist for 4 years, trained to come back. I thought she and I understand each other in some ways. We sat outside after on her porch, the sun going flat and red over the western ridge. She had a blanket around her shoulders. It was going to freeze tonight. I could feel it in the air, that particular weight. She looked out at the fence post, the stain still there, dark on the wood. She said, "I shouldn't have named it." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Things you name, you lose harder." I said, "Yes," I thought, "but things you name you have, really have, for as long as you have them." She looked at me sideways. Something shifted in her face, not a smile exactly, but close to one, something underneath a smile. She said, "That's a generous way to think about it." I said, "It's the only way I've found that holds up." The stars came out. We didn't talk much more. The cold came in from the north, and she pulled her blanket tighter and didn't go inside, and I didn't either. Dale Gantry came the next afternoon. I was in the yard when his horse came up the track alone. He rode in and stopped and didn't get off his horse, which told me something about how far his change of heart went, but he was there. And he looked at the porch where Delia was standing, and he said what he'd done, and he said it wrong, mostly defensive, hedged, more excuse than apology, but he finished with, "I shouldn't have. It was yours." Delia said nothing for a moment, then she said, "Thank you for coming." Dale looked at me, I looked back at him. He rode out. She came down off the porch and stood beside me, and we both watched him go. She said, "He's going to hate you for this." I said, "He already did." She said, "Worse now." I said, "It doesn't concern me." She turned to look at me. The afternoon light was in her face, and the look she gave me, I have thought about that look. It was a measuring look, but not suspicious. It was the look of someone who has been assessing the world for a long time alone and has just come to an assessment they weren't expecting. Something in it was almost wondering. Like, here is something I did not plan for. She said, "Why did you do that, really?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "Because you are a fair person and you were wronged, and because I wanted it to be righted." She said, "You could have ridden on. Most would have." I said, "Most would. That's not something I'm interested in being." She held my gaze for a moment, and then she nodded once, and that was all. The boy came at sundown with a young red tail. I don't know where he found it, farther on than I expected, probably from the state of his horse and the dust on him. But he brought it, a tiercel male, small and fierce, tied to a proper block perch with decent jesses, not abused. Maybe 2 years old. Wild caught, probably, but not recently wild. Someone had started the work on it. He handed it to me, not to Delia, to me, which told me Dale had not explained the situation right, and I carried it to where Delia was standing by the paddock fence. I held out my forearm, the hawk on my fist, looking at her. She looked at the hawk for a long time. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were bright, not quite wet. She pulled on her gauntlet. She had gone for it without thinking, had it in her hand before the boy was off his horse, which told me everything about what kind of person she was, and she held out her wrist, and I transferred the hawk to her with both hands, steady and slow. The hawk stepped across, set its feet, looked around at the new world it was in. Delia looked down at it, and then she looked up at me, and she had both hands on the bird, and something in her face had opened up, some room in her that had been shut since the morning before. She said, "He's good." I said, "He's young, he'll need work." She said, "I know how to do that." I said, "I know you do." She held my eyes over the hawk's head. Her hands were sure, the bird settling on her wrist like it had always been there, and she was looking at me with something I will tell you plainly I had not seen in a long time, not gratitude, or not only that, something past gratitude, the look of a person who has been alone a long time and has found, without looking for it, someone they are not alone with, even for this one day. She said, "You're going back north tomorrow." I said, "Yes." She said, "Will you trade here again?" I said, "When I have things worth trading." She said, "You generally do." I rode north the next morning in the cold, my horse breathing fog, the ground hard under him. I have been a chief of my people for 11 years. I have negotiated with men who thought they were better than me. I have fed my people through hard winters and buried my elders and sat with dying warriors and held my children when they were afraid. I have lived a large life, and mostly I have lived it without complaint and without asking anything back that I couldn't earn. But I will tell you, riding out of that valley with the hawk's feather she had pressed into my hand at the gate, not Cora's feather, one of the new birds pulled from the block perch, smooth and whole and warm from his body, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. I felt seen. Not seen the way a man is seen when he makes himself useful, or when he proves a thing to people who doubted. Seen the way you are seen by someone who is looking at you, not at what you represent or what you can do or what side of a line you stand on. Just at you. She had looked at me over that hawk's head, and whatever she saw, she found it worth holding, worth being in company with, even for a day. I know how the world works. She is a white woman homesteading alone in a territory that doesn't know what to do with either of us. The gantry men will not be the last trouble. My own people have enough to keep me home for seasons at a time, and what the whites are doing to this land, to our land, I hold no good illusions about how all of it ends. But she is there, fair trading, straight-backed, hawk on her wrist and rifle by the door, and she knows I am here. And when I come back into that valley with pelts and dried meat, she will come out onto the porch and look at me with that clear, level gaze and shake my hand, and somewhere in the world that will be a true thing. I tucked the feather inside my coat, against my chest, where the cold couldn't reach it. The horse picked up his pace. He knows the way home. I let him go.